Yes, every lecture should be recorded. Sorry, I disabled auto recording because the uh, videos at the beginning were being recorded. Um, yeah, luckily nothing of major importance was missed in the beginning. Thank you for reminder. I will re-enable the auto recording to my computer so that doesn't happen again. Uh, Thank you. Yeah, so communication is this broad term that covers like a message. So successful communication requires a little bit more because anything can communicate with anything. Like, for instance, we communicate with animals all the time. If you have a pet dog or pet cat, you probably, if you've gone through rough times, pardon the pun, if you talk to your dog, you might have sat down and talked about how your partner has cheated on you or if you lost a loved one. Sorry for the sad times and the memories, but you've said some pretty heavy things to your pet. And there's no way in hell your pet has understood those things. They've understood probably the raw emotion and they've comforted you, but they haven't understood the deep nuances. So you've communicated with your pet, but there has definitely been a communication failure. They haven't understood everything. Successful communication requires a little bit more. So there's some specific things a sender needs to do. They need to be able to do what is called encoding a message. So you have this idea in your head, and this idea or message needs to be, transferred into some sort of communication. So some sort of code, we call it. So you have this idea, it's encoded into a code. That code is sent to a recipient, and that recipient then has to decode the message. So, you have this thought, it's encoded into a code, then it's decoded. If if communication is successful, then the sender and the recipient know how to encode and decode a message. Um, it's just like, I don't know, you think back to the wars and they're, trying to communicate with each other through encryption and decrypting. It's the same sort of idea. If you want successful communication, the person receiving the message needs to know the code and how to, understand the message. So dogs can communicate with each other because they understand what the barks mean. Two people speaking English can communicate with each other because they understand what English means. Someone who speaks English and someone who speaks Russian can have difficulties because the person speaking English doesn't know how to decode Russian, and the person speaking Russian doesn't know how to decode English. So, would unknown jargon represent an encoding failure or a decoding failure? Well, that depends uh, on the environment. So, if let's say you are a student in, say, a mathematics conference or something, and you're sitting in on a professional talk. If you don't understand what the mathematician is saying up front, that's going to be a decoding failure because you're in their environment. If a mathematician is coming to an undergrad lecture, talking to first year calculus students and he's using advanced terminology, there's an encoding failure there because he should be simplifying things down, right? So it's about the environment, it's about who you're talking to. So, it's not necessarily always a failure because sometimes there can be context that helps you figure things out. So really we should think about, the failure in terms of just general, like basic understanding. Think about it between species or between languages. Let's just think about it in terms of that and not maybe necessarily like specific uh, jargon, just to keep it simple. But yeah, you can still apply it to that specific question if you want, but we'll keep it simple in this course. So that's successful communication. Um, but communication doesn't just have to be vocal. It can be non-vocal. In fact, most communication in the animal world is not vocal. We think of communication as vocal because that's how we do things as humans. But there's all these different types of non-vocal communication. In fact, when we watch animals in the real world, a lot of what we see is non-vocal. We don't pick up a lot of it. Like for instance, with dogs and scent, when they leave urine to mark their territory, we don't pick that up. We don't have the smelling power that dogs have. We don't walk by a fire hydrant and say, "Oh yeah, that one dog has just pissed here recently." We don't pick that up. Dogs do. It'd be a horrible world if we could pick that up. Uh, I talked about some of these last week, so we don't really need to talk about these ones specifically, but they're here if you want some more information. So, what I do want to talk about instead are these specific pictures because we can get some information here. You can look at these and you could probably interpret what's happening in these pictures. So, in the top left, when you take a look at these baboons, uh, well, what do you see here? What's being communicated? They're baring their fangs here. They're retracting their lips. They're showing their teeth. They're snarling a bit. If you go near these baboons, you're probably about to get beat up. I would not recommend going near these guys. They're pretty angry, and you can tell that. What about this skunk right here? Maybe if I draw some lines, it might help communicate what's about to happen with this skunk. And because I have the brain of a 13-year-old, I'm going to draw the lines because I find it humorous. There we go. Yeah, that's about what's going to happen out of this skunk. But yeah, so that's what's going to happen there. Uh, it's getting ready to spray, and we can see that as humans. What are the dogs doing in the top right? What is this dog communicating by laying on its back? Is this dog friendly right now? Is this dog ready to attack? Is this dog shy? Well, we can determine what's happening here. A dog isn't going to expose itself when it's being threatened. This dog feels pretty safe. It's non-threatening right now. It's inviting the other dog to play. So these are all ways that animals can communicate non-vocally. And actually, humans do this too. You can tell when someone is reserved or they're being threatened, especially academically. You can see this in office hours sometimes. It's kind of funny when people get defensive. They'll cross their arms, they'll cross their legs. You can see this with professors too. When you start to question their ideas, they'll start doing this. Um, and when they open up, their arms will be open. They'll be more relaxed when they're open to ideas. Sorry, I see a question. For the assignment, do we need to use all the design features of human language or some of them? I'll go over the assignment at the end, but you'll be talking about each of them. So, I mean, these are ways that we can do, non-vocal communication. So when we talk about the specific animals and how they communicate, we'll mostly be focusing on non-vocal communication because that's what's interesting. They have really elaborate non-vocal communication systems. Humans not so elaborate compared to animals. But when we talk about communication, we need to talk about it in a way where we can capture non-vocal systems and vocal systems. So we need to really break things down into small units. So we talk about these things called signs. And signs capture non-vocal communication and vocal communication. And you can think of signs similar to something like sign language, although it's not really similar. So for now, let's step away from that idea, and we're just thinking about a unit of meaning. That's it. A sign is just a unit of meaning. And here's a picture from the textbook. I think it's a really nice picture, so I've used it here. It's a nice model. So uh, we have some terms here, but we'll just go through this. So a sign is one unit of meaning that consists of two parts. It has a term called a signifier and a signified, but I like to think of it as form and concept. So a form, this thing on the right here, is how it's expressed. So the expression of the sign. So in this case, what you see here in these slashy brackets, this is the pronunciation in the real world. So we'll talk a little bit more about uh, pronunciation, about what this means uh, in the International Phonetic Alphabet next week when we talk about sounds, words, and sentences. But this is just the vocalization of tree. So the expression here is tree. This is what's called the signifier or the form. This is me saying tree. And on the left, this is the concept, also known as the signified. So when I say tree, uh, This is the essentially the mental image that you get. So this is the concept in the real world. When I make an expression, this is the mental image that comes up. This is what I'm talking about in the real world. This is what I'm trying to communicate. So when I say tree, you get this idea of a physical tree in your head. We could do something else. I could say the word happy. And this is an abstract idea, but when I say happy, that expression of saying happy, you could get this abstract feeling of happiness. And that could be the concept that you think of in your head. So that would be another sign. And just to draw out what this would look like with the same sort of diagram, um, this would be how I pronounce it. Don't worry too much about what these mean at the time. And then this could be the concept. So I need to be very, very clear when I say here that this is a concept, the concept of happiness. This is not an image. Like this is not a picture. This is just a concept. Uh, it's it's impossible to put a concept on a piece of paper, so we demonstrate it with an image, but this is not an image. This is just a concept. It's a mental image. Yeah, and this whole study of science is called semiotics. I bring that up because Zachary has said in chat that semiotics is interesting. Yes, it is. This concept of signs is really like pre-linguistics or the very beginning of linguistics. This isn't studied too much here in North America anymore, but it is very big in Europe. Okay, I want to show you one more example with an image. So, one more example of a sign. So, without pronunciation. So, I'm going to do an expression, a signifier, a form that isn't pronunciation. Sorry. So, it's not what I want. Let's do this. So, this could be a form or an expression. You can call this a form, an expression, or a signifier. So, here what I've done is I've just filled it in with a color. So the form, the expression I've used is a blank color, or sorry, not a blank color, but like a filled in color red. So the concept that I'm expressing here, the concept is the color red. So as a sign, I've used the image red, and in your head, what's happening is you get this mental image of red. So what I'm trying to demonstrate with this example is that the expression doesn't have to be vocal. The expression of the sign can be non-vocal. In this case, it's an image. So the two examples down here, tree and happy, these are vocal expressions. This is vocal communication, while the example with red above, this is non-vocal communication. This is an image. And can an expression and concept be the same? Uh, Well, the concept is really a mental image. So y- the expression, the I mean, philosophically, they do have to be a little bit different. I mean, like the expression can be a picture of someone, and the mental image, the concept can be that mental image of someone. So they're basically the same thing. But one is a mental image and the other one is a physical image. So the answer to that is like yes, but not really, because one is real in the real world and the other one is in your head. I'm sorry if that wasn't like the clearest answer, but the answer is like yes, they're the same, but not really because one is real and one is in your head. Okay, so that's what signs are. And at first, this can seem fairly straightforward, but there are always some confusions. So if you do have any, like, interrupt me at any time or ask questions because uh, it's never as straightforward as it seems when you do it yourself. Especially when we talk about types of signs. But when we talk about types of signs, maybe things might become clearer. You might understand where to start asking questions. So we have different types of signs. And the question always becomes, well, how do we classify signs? Should we classify it based on how we express a sign? Should we classify it based on the concept? But we don't do that. We classify signs based on the relationship between the concept and how we express it. And this is where things can become difficult. Uh, but I have some examples here and we'll do some practice right after so we can work with this. So there's three different types of signs, and we'll use some words in order to really understand these. Uh, the first type of sign is an icon, and with icon, I like to think of pictures. So this means that the expression matches the concept. So in this case, when we take a look at this image of a person, the image of the person matches the concept. So like with the color red, we showed the color red and the concept we got was red. So that's an icon. In this case, the picture of the person we're trying to get and the concept we're trying to get is the person they match. If it helps, one represents and takes on the role of signifier, which is the expression that does this. Signified is the concept that's signified by from the expression. That could help. Yeah. So if we were to do a little diagram, so this could be the expression. We have a little person here, and then the concept that we're trying to get across is the same thing. So this is the concept of the person. So one is the picture and the other is the mental image. So it's an icon. Or for example, if I wanted to, um, I don't know, try to get the concept of a circle to you. I'm trying to explain what a circle is. And I say, okay, here's an image of a circle. And then in your head, I say, okay, this is the concept I'm trying to get to as a circle. There's an icon because the expression matches the mental image. So icons are generally the most straightforward because it's what you see is what you're supposed to get in your head. I'm going to skip index. I'm going to do some symbol first, and we'll go back to index last because index is usually the most complicated. Symbol is an arbitrary relationship between the expression and the concept. So one extreme are things like metaphors. So the example I have here is like a dove symbolizes peace. So this is very literary. You see a dove and you think of peace. Or you see a rose and you think of love. So a rose can symbolize love. Let me move this so you can see it on the screen because my cam was covering it. So that's another thing. Uh, maybe what I should do is I should draw it in the circle so that way it's similar. And that's a rose. That's a rose. I'm not good at drawing, but that is a rose. And the thing you're trying to get from that is love. Okay. Um, but a lot of things are symbols. A lot of things are quite arbitrary. So, um, a lot of the examples I want to use are an exercise coming up. So we'll keep it for that. But if if you look at something and the concept you get is not the same as what you see, or it's not very closely related to what you see, it's symbolic. Many signs that we have in human language are symbolic. And we'll see examples in the exercises in the slides coming up. Now, the last one is index. And the key word here is indicates. Indicates. So for example, and here's the most classic example you get with index signs or indexical signs, is when you see smoke, that indicates that you will see fire because you cannot have smoke without fire. In order for smoke to exist, you need fire. So that's one of the classic examples. Another one of the examples that I could give you is imagine you're driving along and you smell the scent of skunk. If you smell the scent of skunk, what does that indicate? Well, that indicates that you have some skunk around. A skunk has been around. So if you smell the scent of skunk, uh, you know that there's been some skunk around very recently. Would police sirens be an index? So if you've heard police sirens, then yeah, you know there's police around, and there's been some sort of um, sirens would be indexical of a police matter. Yeah, Colleen, that's perfect. Yes, if you hear police sirens, that's indexical of some police matter. There's been something that's happened that has been violent, so there's been some danger around. If you hear an ambulance sirens, you know there has been an accident around. There's uh, some life has been in danger. Uh, are nouns like tree or when someone says a word symbols? Uh, we'll get to that. The answer is yeah. Many of the nouns that we say are symbolic. Yes. Yeah. So Colleen has answered that perfectly. Yeah. What about a face that reminds you of someone? So if you see a face that reminds you of someone, this again, this would be so if you see a face that sees something else, it's not an exact match, but it could imitate or resemble. So you could argue that is iconic. A lot of the facial features that you see would be iconic, representative of the thing that you're reminded of, because it would trigger that thing in your head. We'll talk about the type of words, the signs of words in a second. It would be symbolic in the sense that you need to pull over. So, Jim, we'll talk about in the sense that you need to pull over. So, the actions, those are a little bit different. So, let's do some practice right here. Okay, so we have three different images. And in this case, I haven't given you the signified and the signifier, but let's talk about the different types of signs that these could be. So you'll have to take a look at the image and think about what these could represent. And remember, when we classify these signs, it's about the relationship between what the image is and what it represents. So we have to think about what is being expressed by the sign. What is the concept trying to get across? So um, you can take a look at one of these and you can type in chat what type of uh, sign you think it is and what you think is being expressed by it. Each of these could be more than one type of sign depending on what you think the expression is. So have a go at it. If you have a solution for one of these or a thought, feel free to type right away and I'll write it down. And in a couple of minutes, we'll talk about all the different ones that have come up. So let me just let's give you 2 minutes for this, and then we'll talk. So give me the expression and then give me either iconic, symbol, or index. And I'll just write these down as we go. And I'll try to write down what the expressions are that people are saying. So this is um, crying, Okay, I don't think I got all of those very fast, but I did try to get a few of those. Hunger cry from a sleepy cry, that would be an index. Okay, so let me just scroll up a little bit and take a look. Okay, so we'll take a look at the easy one. So icon of baby, absolutely. It's a picture of a baby. It expresses baby, so yeah, it can be an icon. Icon of cow, yeah, absolutely. It's a picture of a cow. You can get the concept of cow. It can be a cow. A yellow sign icon, um, yeah, sure. Why not? You want a picture of a yellow sign? That can be an icon of a yellow sign. Why not? It's not the best, but it can work. I mean, that's the picture you want in someone's head. You can get it. Uh, let's talk about the hazard sign. So you said radioactive hazard sign or symbol for danger. Yeah, so this is symbolic. Um, it's symbolic. Why is it symbolic? Because this image, let me use a different color. This image right here, this image is completely arbitrary. The fact that you have these little things here with this empty circle in the middle, there's nothing about this that means radioactive or hazard or danger. It's just an arbitrary, circles with openings in it. Like there's nothing in nature or the real world that signals, hey, this is danger. It's just arbitrary. So, but it means danger. We understand this is danger or hazard. Like if we see this, we probably stay away. So it's arbitrary in that sense. So that's why, it's symbolic in that sense. That's why the sign is symbolic. Um, it's why when we see a stop sign, when we just see this shape outside, we don't need letters on it. We just see an octagon that's red and we stop. The octagon is completely arbitrary. Why do we stop when we see a red octagon? Like it's weird, but it's arbitrary. It's symbolic. It tells us to stop and we stop. What about the yellow? Since in nature yellow signals danger. Um, what about the yellow? Well, I mean the yellow triangle on its own maybe. I mean that's getting pretty deep into human nature. I mean, we'd have to do some experiments to see if humans would react the same way to a yellow triangle without any exposure, right? I mean, if we never saw this yellow triangle ever, would we react the same way to it? Um, we have this symbol for a reason, right? If we didn't have this symbol, we probably wouldn't react. Does arbitrary mean that it is made up in a sense? That's another good way of thinking about it. Yeah, it's made up. I mean, it's arbitrary. It's made up. So yellow is tied with fear, right? So that would also be a symbol. Yeah, I mean, if it's made up, if it's man-made, if it's, I mean, if it could be replaced with anything else and still work, it's arbitrary. I mean, the fact that I say yellow instead of local means that it's arbitrary. A yellow could mean caution too. But isn't that how animals respond, like with poisonous frogs? I mean, it depends, right? If it's built into your biology, if it's a reflex, then it's not arbitrary. But with this one, understanding this sign is not built into our biology. It's not an instinct. It's not a reflex. This is something learned. This specific sign is something learned. It's symbolic. It's arbitrary. All symbols, yeah. In this case, it's cultural. Players got this. Um, the symbol for cow, I'm not quite sure how this would be symbolic because, this animal, if we think about the word cow itself, the word cow would be symbolic, but the image of the cow itself is not symbolic. So I don't think that we can really get a symbol out of cow. But if we just had the word cow, that could be symbolic. Um, cow reminds you of milk. Cow reminds you of milk. Um, if you see cow and your mental image is milk, maybe if it was a specific cow like Baby Bell, hmm, it could be an index of milk. You think of a farm. Okay. Yeah, so then it might be better if you have an index then. But I think it would be if you see milk, it would be an index of cow. If you see a bell, you think of an index of cow. Um, Also think of certain milk companies. Yeah, so this is why establishing the signified is also very important. So, yeah, okay, you could have symbolic relationships then, you could have indexical relationships. Yeah, we should be a little bit more specific with what you see. Thank you. This is really good. I have to establish the signified and the signifier in test questions. This is a great lesson for me. Okay, thank you. Oh, this is great. It's good that your minds think like this. Okay, yeah, because yeah, symbols and indexes are coming everywhere from what you're thinking of. Okay, and great with the babies. An index of crying and sadness. When you see the tears on a baby's eye, that is an index. It's the tears on a baby's eye are indicating crying. It's indicating sadness. It could be indicating hunger. So yeah, this term index for indication, that's great. So I did see that in the chat and I saw that and I wrote that down. So fantastic. So it seems like you have a good grasp on signs, and the discussion about the cows is also good. Um, we won't dive too much into the cows though, or we'll never finish everything. So let's talk about the next type of sign, words, which I already alluded to, but we'll go more in depth with words. So what types of signs are words? And I think you already know the answer to this based on what you've talked about, but uh, basically, so we have Bosnian, German, and English, and the words all mean the same thing across all the languages. But if you take a look at English, table, car, work, happy, you probably understand what those mean. Like everyone in this chat probably knows what those mean. But then you take a look at the Bosnian words and German words, and if I didn't tell you that they all mean the same thing, you probably might not know what those words mean. And the fact that you might not know what those words mean tell you they're not iconic. Because if those words were iconic, you would know what they meant because they would be icons. If something is an icon, you would look at it and you would know what it means because it's iconic. It represents what it means. If it were indexical, you would look at it and it would indicate something in the real world, but it doesn't. These are arbitrary. You look at it and you say, I don't know what it's supposed to represent in the real world. So words, words are symbolic. They're all arbitrary. The fact that we call um, the word bed, yeah, the word bed is a fun example because it looks like a bed, right? But no, again, it's just arbitrary. The fact that we picked bed to write it down is just arbitrary. Um, we could have picked any word. We could have picked I don't know, why did we pick bed? Why didn't we call it a dabble do? Like, why not? Would characters be an index? Well, not necessarily. A character like D, you know, why do we pronounce D as duh? Or why do we pronounce P as puh? Or why do we pronounce C as kuh? Well, I mean, we don't always pronounce C as kuh. Sometimes we pronounce it as suh. Sometimes we pronounce it as ch. It depends on the language. Sometimes sh, sometimes chi, sometimes hi. It all depends on the language, right? So most of our letters, our numbers, our like everything is symbolic. Chinese characters, um, hieroglyphs or image-based writing be indexical then. Some of those are iconic. Some are iconic that have changed over time and become symbolic by being simplified. But some of those are still iconic, or some of those are still iconic. Most of the writing is not indexical. So usually the hieroglyphs or image-based writing is either iconic, and some of them have been simplified to the point where they're now symbolic in nature. Okay, so just to reiterate before we move on, these are symbolic because These are just arbitrary words. We could choose basically any word instead of the words that we used. Instead of saying pen, for example, we could have called this a gar, and it wouldn't have made any difference. Pen doesn't describe this in any shape or form. Okay. I do want to get through signs before we take a break, so I won't. I'll try to skip through a lot of the texts and just sort of talk about general stuff. Since with the lecture slides, you can sort of read this on your own. Symptomatic signs are a special type of indexical sign. So symptomatics, you can just think of the word symptom, and these are all internal things. So things like sickness or emotions, like when you get sick, you get a fever, your temperature rises. You cannot control this. Um, when someone hurts you, when you get cut, or when you get hit, you'll let out a yelp, or you'll bruise. These are all things that indicate you've been hurt. They indicate that you've been sick, and you have no control over these. When you can't breathe, like your lung has been punctured, or you're being, I don't know, you cannot get air, you gasp for air. These are completely out of your control. So these are symptoms, symptomatic. They're all indexical because they indicate a problem in the body. So not all indexical signs are symptomatic. These are based on living things. So humans and animals can have symptomatic signs. So smoke and fire are indexical but not symptomatic because fire is not a living thing. But body temperature from sickness, that's symptomatic because it's a human. What Jim was saying earlier from doing an action, some signs can act as signals. So this is when you see a sign and you act based on the sign. So for instance, traffic, this is a very typical example. You're driving, you see a traffic light change, it goes from green to yellow to red, and then you slow down because the sign has changed. Quite literally, a sign has changed. It signals you to do something and you respond to it. Um, here's a really interesting one with moths. So, this is something not for humans. Uh, a female moth says, "Yo, it's time for me to get a lover." It releases a pheromone, and then a moth is like, "Yo, I need a lover too." And then it travels like 6 kilometers to go find the female moth. And that's another type of signal because the female does something and the male moth is like, I'm a thirsty dude, and it does the 6 kilometers of travel to go get it. Uh, sorry, that was not the most elegant way that I could have put that, but um, you know, the sign makes a change, and then something makes an action based on that change. Uh, it's actually human communication too. Someone can say, I'm a bit cold in here, and then someone will stand up and go close the window. It's amazing. uh, words and actions can cause someone else to do quite a bit of work to do something for you. So these are examples of signal. It's a sign that causes someone else to do an action. Okay. um So just before the break, we'll talk about graded and discrete signs, and then we'll take the break. So, uh, graded and discrete signs, these are not different from iconic, indexical, and symbolic. These are like another dimension. So, iconic, indexical, and symbolic signs could be either graded or discrete. Graded just means that there are like a continuum of different levels. So think of like a baby crying. The baby can start very quietly. Like, you know when the baby starts quietly, and then you're like, oh my God, it's about to get very loud, and the baby gets very loud, and the crying gets very extreme. Or say on your TV, a TV can start out very quietly, you could raise the volume, and it gets very loud. So there are a lot of different levels to this. You can think like 1 to 100. It's graded. There's a transition. While discrete signs just have steps, like very discrete individual steps. So traffic lights, for instance, there's 1, 2, and 3. A light switch, on or off. Um, I don't know, like an alarm or like a digital clock. has 60 minutes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, or has 60 seconds. You know, you can't see those in between things like you can with a analog clock that just continually goes around and around and around. Um, so yeah, two types of signs there. Yeah, usually with these ones, aren't all clocks discrete because there's no way to be precise enough. So it's not necessarily about precision. It's more just how about the sign displays itself. So for instance, you could have a traffic light that is a graded sign. It just wouldn't be very useful because it would be confusing to understand. Ordinal versus nominal. That's maybe not the best way of thinking about it. It's just about how it's displayed, not necessarily about how useful it is. So is it stepwise? Is it like individual discrete categories, or is it a continuum where you can sort of control like on a continuum where it is? So do you have a lot of control over it, or is it just stepwise individual differences? So there will be examples of that in the practice. What about a speed limit? Um, what about a speed limit? So if you set a specific number like 50, 60, 55, 40, like individual numbers, that's discrete. If you're able to say like you can go 55.565, if you can grade any number, any specific precise number, then you can have a graded sign in that case. Sometimes discrete signs can become graded if you go specific enough, which is a little bit confusing. So sometimes you do have that thing. So usually when we talk about graded signs, we talk about changing or raising or lowering. The sky turning orange, meaning night is coming, that is a fantastic example of a graded sign. Yeah. So the sky turning orange in that case. Sunset, sunrise, that's a fantastic example of a graded sign. Okay, it's 3:22. We'll take a 10-minute break. If you have any questions, you can type them in chat during the break and I'll uh, talk about them when we get back. Would the feeling of falling count as a sign? Let me think about that one, but we'll come back in 10 minutes. So I will see you then. Okay, that's enough memeing in the chat from me, but we'll continue with the meme songs during the next break. Okay, the question, would the feeling of falling count as a sign? Yes, that would be a symptomatic sign from the body. The feeling of falling is something that your body does before you fall asleep to make sure that your body is not moving. Okay, so there was a slide before just to sort of summarize the differences between animal communication signs and human signs, but we'll sort of talk about that as we go through. Throughout the rest of this lecture, I'll try not to really talk like you know, not to read off the slides, but just sort of talk casually about everything. And I'll really try to do that for most of the course, just because you do have the slides and you can read all the text yourself, and more just so for the signs as we went through. That was just to start us off. But there's 12 design features of human language, and I know it looks like a lot of stuff that's scary, but the nice thing about linguistics terminology is that a lot of the terms that we have are very self-explanatory. Um, and if you don't know the terms, that's okay, because once you learn the terms once, uh, the terms will be very consistent throughout all of linguistics. So once you know what semanticity means, when you see semanticity anywhere else in linguistics, it means something very similar. Uh, sometimes terms have multiple different terms to mean the same thing, as we'll see here, but uh, it's fairly consistent. So we'll go through each of these. Not all of these are incredibly detailed. Some of these are just one or two lines as a definition, and the application of them isn't really uh, too difficult. So we'll talk about each of these in terms. So semanticity. Okay, first of all, to put these in perspective, these are the 12 things that human language has that makes human language special. And animal communication systems will have some of these, but not all of these. So no animal communication system has all of these. In fact, most of them do not have the majority of these. Most communication systems will have maybe 3 to 5 of these, but definitely not all 12. So the first one is semanticity. And this just says that when you have a message, it's fixed to a real world situation. Okay. So when you make some sort of vocalization or non vocalization, when you communicate some message, um, it's a fixed sign. Like the sign is fixed. When I say happy, it always means happy. And until that's changed, it always means happy. So when I say tree, it refers to a tree in the real world in my dialect, in my communication system. This is something that really every animal system has. So, is this something unique to humans? No, but this is something fundamental to language. It's fundamental to communication. So semanticity just says when I speak, it's or when I speak, when I make vocalizations, when I communicate, it relates to something in the real world. Okay. Uh, interchangeability. Interchangeability just means that when I communicate with someone, they can communicate back with me. And this goes with animals too. If a dog can talk to another dog, then that dog should be able to talk back. Now, not all animal systems can do this. Sometimes within a group of animals, um, there are only certain members of that species that can communicate with each other, and not every member of that species can communicate with each other. How would semanticity relate to dogs? Uh, for instance, when a dog sees a mailman and it wants to do an aggressive bark, an attack or something, its bark, its aggression basically means I want to attack. It's a fixed bark. It's an aggressive bark. That bark always means aggression. When it bares its fangs, it has this aggressive, or sorry, when it bares its fangs, when it does that communication, when it expresses that sign is fixed. That sign demonstrates aggression. Okay, so that's a message. That's a sign. That's not vocalization. That's a non-vocal sign, but it's a fixed sign. And that's real world. That's an expression. So I know when we talk about this, we're thinking human language, we're thinking vocalizations, but these systems can be for non-vocalizations too. So really, almost every animal system has semanticity. A lot of it is non-vocal. Same with like the skunk, for example. When it's about to spray, it makes a specific movement, and that is fixed. So it will always make that. What animals wouldn't have interchangeability? There are bees. We'll talk about bees in a moment. Bees will not have interchangeability. Arbitrariness. So we just talked about words with arbitrariness. So we don't need to talk too much about this. But as a reminder, like hand, the concept of hand, in each language, there's a different word for hand. So the word that we use to represent hand is completely arbitrary. Hand in English, te in Japanese, uh, German, French, Finnish, these all have different words. It's completely arbitrary. And if you don't know the language, you don't understand it. Now, there's these one type of words that we talked about very briefly last week called onomatopoeic words, words like buzz, buzz, ring, ring. And these have been said to be iconic because they sound like what they represent, but uh, they're not really iconic. For the most part, they're still arbitrary. And that's because when we make these onomatopoeic words, like for instance, dogs, we say rough, rough, we're still trying to make those sounds in our language. We're still using sounds that we speak in English. Um, so, for example, indexical. Indexical, this is still done, it's still symbolic because we're taught these. And here's the demonstration. I'm going to demonstrate this. What animals make these sounds? These are onomatopoeic words in non-English languages. Now, if you can look at these words and have literally zero difficulties, no difficulties at all, if you get these immediately when you hear these or see these, then maybe you can say they're indexical. Maybe you can say they're iconic. But if you struggle for even a little bit with these, this demonstrates that there is a largely symbolic nature to these. So, for example, what animal do you think makes the sound cluck, 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 cluck? Horse? Fox? Type of bird? Horse hooves? Cricket? Chicken? Okay, well, someone's got it right. It's a cluck, 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 cluck. It's chicken. It's a chicken. Yeah. In Finnish, chickens go cluck, 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 cluck. So if you don't speak Finnish, you're not going to be completely accurate with that. Here's German. I'm not going to pronounce this completely correctly because it'll give it away. But if you just read this like you would as an English speaker, you might go like gruns, 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 gruns. What animal do you think this is? Gruns, gruns. Pig, frog, a car. Oh, that's not an animal. Uh, a pig. Yeah. Owen Wilson in Cars. Wow, gruns. Yeah, okay. That is a pig. That is a pig. There's a lot of languages that are very similar to the gruns gruns for pigs. In English, it's oink. Like, what's up with that? Oink. Really, it's more like a. I can't do it. I got nasal problems right now. But I get that ingressive nasal sound for pigs. What about Polish? Howl, howl, howl. Got dog for owl, 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 dog, wolf, dog, owl, wolf, frog, frog, owl. Well, it's dog. It's dog. How is dog in Polish? Here's dog in Japanese. Wan wan, wan wan. That's very different. Woof woof is English or roof or rr. That rr isn't even like English sounds. It's just like a vocalization, right? But it's close. Here is probably one you'll get. Any Legend of Zelda fans will get this one pretty quickly. Kokoriko. Rooster. Yeah, a lot easier. Rooster. That's a rooster. Yeah. So I mean, you can see where a lot of video games will take onomatopoeic words from other languages in order to take enemy names. You didn't know that? There you go. Some extra facts, some nerd facts. Yeah, this is some evidence that a lot of onomatopoeic words are still largely symbolic. So what happens is you hear these sounds from animals and you try to say, okay, we need to make these sounds that represent what animals make, but you still try to make the sounds that are consistent with the sounds in your own language, that are consistent with the syllable structures in your own language. So you still have to adapt those sounds to something that the speakers can say. So, these are words that you would find in these languages that are consistent, just like oink and woof and rough and meow. These are things that we say in English. So, cocorico isn't really something that we would say in English. It's not very English sounding, so it's not what we'd say. Instead, we say cockadoodle doo. I mean, that's still weird, but it's more English than cocorico. And how, HAU, that's not something we see in English. So we wouldn't really pick that up as something that we'd say for a dog sound. Woof versus bow, meow versus nyan. Yeah, Japanese cat sound. nyan instead of meow. That's very different to us. Well, why would you say nyan as a cat sound? That doesn't sound anything like it to us for the most part, but that's how it is. So yeah, uh, it's mostly arbitrary automatic PIC words, mostly symbolic. They're still somewhat iconic, somewhat, very little, but we would classify them as symbolic. Okay, that's arbitrariness. Creativity or productivity are called the same thing. We talked about this last week. Uh, Creativity just says we can create new words at any time. So any thought that we have, we can just create a new word or new sentence. And so a new sentence, uh, a new word, a new sound, and we can express it. Um, yeah, we talked about this last week. There's not much more to say. I like this comic. I find the easiest way to expand my vocabulary is to make up words. How true. I think it's something like 2,000 words are added to the English language every single year. And something like only 100 words are widely adapted by the population, something like that. It's incredible. But yeah, we create new words all the time. They're just not widely adapted. A lot of it is jargon. No animals do this. No animals do this, not at least that have been documented. So this is very specifically human. Displacement is another interesting thing that humans, uh, I shouldn't say humans uniquely do, but humans do very well and very easily and can do um, in a can do in a very large capacity. So displacement, um, in like a physics sense, in a physical sense, where you can talk about things far in space or far in time. So animals can usually talk about immediate, uh, immediate location or immediate time. So they can talk about what's in front of them or what's like really close to them. But humans, we can talk about things we did last week. We can talk about the future. We can talk about things that are like all the way across the world. We can talk about things that aren't even real. Animals cannot do that. They can only talk about things that are real. They cannot talk about things that are imaginary. So displacement talks about that. So the fact that we can write books about imaginary worlds is something that is very uniquely human. So displacement is just the ability to communicate about things that are not right in front of us. So yeah, that comes from the word displaced. If this is a little fast at any point, I can always go back or review things. And when we do exercises, I'll make sure that when I talk about each point, I reiterate what each of them mean, just in case this is a little fast. Um, okay, discreteness. Discreteness is much like when we talked about discrete signs. So individual steps. Discreteness means that when we communicate, the components that we communicate with or communicate in can be broken apart into individual units. So, in this case, in English or in any language, this means that the sounds that we speak and the words that we speak can be broken up into individual units that are different from each other. So the example I have here is like, for instance, in pin and bin, we know that the P and the B are different from each other. Well, we also know that we have the sound I and the sound n, and all of these are different and we can rearrange them. So we can also have the word nib, like a nib on a pen or something. Or if we have the word bed and bet, we know that D and T are different from each other. So we know that D and T are different. We also know that in a sentence, the word bed means something different than bet. So discreteness tells us that we have individual parts. Many animals can do this as well. So when we see bees in a bit and they do a little dance, the dance has different components to it. So we can take their dance and we can break them apart into little components and we can talk about what each component means. Uh, Another example is with the English plural morpheme s. So with cats, for example, we know what cat means. We know that plural s means that we have more than one. So, we can break these things apart into individual units. So that's what discreteness means. We have these components that are different from each other. So this is really important. If we didn't have discreteness, then we wouldn't have individual units, which means that we couldn't take individual units and combine them in different ways in order to get like an infinite amount of different things. We would be very limited in our vocabulary without discreteness. So discreteness patterns a lot with the next design feature, which is called duality of patterning. And this is really like one of the major features. This is responsible for like um, for everything that we can do with sentences. But before that, are the units meaning sound or writing? So the units that we talk about are always vocal in our case. So sounds, so the the sounds we produce and the words we produce. Writing this when we write things down, this is just a convention. It's a system that we use to express words and sounds. So writing in itself is not language. It's a tool that we use to express language. And we'll talk about that more in week 4. So duality of patterning lets us take our individual units and combine them into larger units. So this is what's going to be the focus of next week when we talk about the actual different components of language. So we have these individual sounds. So for instance, what we're going to build up to is the sentence he eats snacks. So we have all these individual sounds. So like h, e, t, s, n, a, k, s. So individual sounds there. Then we can build these up into units of meaning. So you don't have to worry about these things in brackets right now. These are just the pronunciations of these words. We'll talk about consonants next week, and you don't ever have to worry about the vowels, but these are just how they're pronounced. Um, so we talk about these things called morphemes, which are units of meaning. So he, eat, that's a word. We have this agreement. So when you have a word like he, you have to say he eats instead of he eat. So he eats, that S is a marker for grammar. And then snack is a word. And then that S makes it plural. So he eats snacks instead of he eats snack. Okay. And then to form a word, you have to attach these little grammatical markers to the words themselves. So you get these words, he eats snacks, and then you combine all these words together into a sentence, and you get he eats snacks. And usually, when we take individual words and combine them into a sentence, we speak a little bit faster and we speak a little bit more efficiently. So we lose some sounds. So instead of he eats snacks, we get something like heat snacks, heat snacks. And, we lose a couple sounds there. But duality of patterning here is letting us take all of these individual components and get something much larger out of it, much more meaningful. Because all of these sounds individually don't have meaning. The H doesn't have meaning, the I doesn't have meaning, the T doesn't have meaning. It's not until we combine them that they get meaning. And the order that we combine them in gives them different meanings. And the way that they form words gives them different meanings. And the way those words form into sentences give them a different meaning. So if we said, you know, he eats a snack compared to he eats snacks, you get a different meaning. So because of discreteness and duality of patterning, we can generate an infinite amount of sentences and we can say whatever we want. Any idea that ever comes to our head, we can express. It might not be easy, but we can do it. Okay, so I think that's about half of the design features. So before I keep going, are there any questions about the first six or so? Okay, I'll keep going then. Oh, there is one hand raised. Okay.
Okay, wait, can you hear me? Is it working?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, so I have like a question in terms of, so this is like 12 features of the human language, right? And as we've known from what we learned last week is the fact that we have second functions. So we have the vocal cords, for example, or the aspects of our mouths that pronounces sounds.
Mhm.
Now, this is kind of hypothetical in a way. So let's just say we do meet aliens. All right. Now don't get me wrong. We meet aliens, and aliens may or may not, we don't know about it, but let's just say they have different quote unquote second functions of organs, let's say, and they communicate perhaps in a different way, but they're able to um, sort of hit all these boxes and maybe have more, or maybe subtract a box, but or like not box, but like features. Um, like, would that be it? Like, could we like at that point, right? I know that's a whole different field at that point. Like, I'm pretty sure there's a whole ton of research that will go into it, but just like briefly looking at what we have here, would that be quote unquote, let's just say alien Y language, right? Could we define that or label that as a language? Like once if they hit all these boxes.
Yeah, so generally, I don't think linguists are too concerned with the vocalization aspect of things. So they would just be looking for these design features. If aliens were shown to have structure in their language, so for instance, like with sign language with humans, it is a language. Even though there are not vocalizations, there are still sound structures and sound patterns to it. I say sound loosely, but you can
Right, right.
still assign the same patterns that we find in sounds to sign language. So linguists do that.
Okay.
So with aliens, although we would expect them, however they communicate, we would expect them to do things differently. Um, linguists would find a way to work with that. And
Interesting.
as was said in
Okay.
that Arrival 2016 has a good look at alien language. When that movie came out, linguists were told everywhere to go watch it. So it is a fictional movie, but uh, it does kind of touch on that. But there are a lot of linguists who are probably very excited to have a chance to work with that, and they would be working very hard to fit the definition of language to aliens.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, this is very abstract in a sense, but it's just thinking of like what we have as features. Because like what I was thinking here is these features are what linguists, I assume linguists have defined as part of human language, what makes human language as is, right? And a lot of it, I feel like it obviously was, investigated and researched and, placed into these 12 features. And that's just because we are able to kind of delve into that. But like it's a bit, I would almost say it's like biased because we only see it as our language. But yeah, yeah, that makes sense.
Oh, of course. I mean, when we
Mhm.
say language, we specifically mean human language, and I mean that's one bias in itself. I mean, there's probably some. I mean, there's definitely. I shouldn't say definitely, but if there's something that can communicate better than us, what would we call it, right?
Mm, right.
Right. So
Okay. Cool. Thanks.
we'll see. 50, 60 years, we'll talk again.
I'm gonna be dead. No, I'm kidding. All right.
Okay. So a little exercise that we can go through. I mean, this is pretty pretty straightforward exercise, but um, imagine we have a language. with no duality of patterning. So there's just 10 sounds: A, E, O, I, U, M, N, S, F, M, N, S, F, L, and we cannot combine these sounds to form larger structures. So you see E, and that means table. You see O, that means abstraction. You see F, that means go. And you can't take these units and you can't combine them to make more complex things. There's 10 sounds. How many words can we say in this language with no duality of patterning? Well, we get an amazing, yeah, 10 words. Okay. But imagine we just have 10 sounds and we can combine them to make larger structures. So we take NA, we get drink. We take NU, we can make cake. We get NIFO, we get vacation. We add an S to that, we get vacations. How many words can we say then with a language of duality of patterning? Well, it's infinite. Like we can really generate as many words as we want. So we think about these, like just with one feature, like the difference in how many words we can produce. And generally, one of these applies to humans and one of these applies to animals. And yeah, also the length of a word can be infinite. That's also true. So generally, when we think about human versus animal communication systems, humans are a lot closer to this infinite. Well, we do have infinite capacity, and the animals are going to be a lot closer to having no duality of patterning, with only, say, maybe not 10 expressions, but usually around the 5 to 100 different expressions. And this is just because of this one feature that animals tend to lack. So even in English, our words can be infinitely long. It's just not feasible. Like our memory capacity, our working memory capacity is just not long enough. It's a lot easier to communicate with shorter words and remember those than it is to have longer words, or at least, words with less than 5 syllables typically. There's not too many words in English that have 6 or more syllables. Usually we can do with less. It's also because our syllables are a lot more complex than some syllables in other languages, which we'll dive into a little bit next week. Okay, we have recursion as well. This is another big important one that we talked about last week. So this is when you apply a rule to itself over and over again. We did I forgot the keys are missing last week. The keys on the counter are missing. The keys on the counter in the kitchen are missing. I have two more examples. So, for instance, you can do the kid got angry. Which kid? The kid that made a mess got angry. Which mess? The kid that made a mess that got him in trouble got angry. So, what we can do is we can keep modifying the previous noun with more descriptions in order to make an infinitely long subject and give more and more information. So this is called recursion because we keep embedding and over to give more descriptions. So there's a nice little picture of self-embedding there. If you know the Russian dolls, the what's it called? Matroshkas. Uh, you open the doll, and there's a little smaller doll inside. You open the other doll, there's a smaller doll inside. Um, if you watch movies about drug smuggling, sometimes the one on the inside has like cocaine in it. That's typically how the drugs are smuggled in the movies. Um, but that's an example of recursion in a real life example. We can do this with X knows that Y structures too. So Chris knows that linguistics is fun. Terry knows that Chris knows that linguistics is fun. Uh, Bethany said that, Stephanie said that, Terry said that, Chris said that, Stephen broke up with Mark, and you can go on and on and on. Probably something you heard in high school. So, knows that, said that, wish that. These can go on infinitely. You can start these sentences when you're born, and you can finish them around the time you die in your 90s or 80s or hundreds if you're lucky. That might be a waste of your life, but you could get in the Guinness Book of World Records. So uh, there's no time better to start than right now. Now, what I didn't say last week is is that I didn't give evidence that this is something that humans can do. Of course, we can't just test every single animal. That would be crazy. But this has been tested before. Is can monkeys actually do recursion? Now, one way to test this is to see if they can distinguish recursive patterns from non-recursive patterns. So I've tried to distinguish or to illustrate a recursive pattern from a non-recursive pattern for you. So to illustrate this, uh, there's what's called AN to the BN patterns. So what this means is that there's a certain number of A's followed by the same number of B's. So these are just abstract A's and B's. These could be um, X knows that Y or whatever. Let's not think too hard about what this means for examples. And then we have AB to the N. This just means that we have the same number of pairs AB, AB, AB. So I've tried to illustrate these with these two charts. So as we can see here, we have three A's followed by three B's. And in the second example, we have AB, AB, AB. And the idea is that humans can distinguish these like no problem. Like you can look at these two examples and you can see, oh, these are two different structures. AAABBB is different from ABABAB. If I asked you to do this seriously, you'd look at me and say, Trevor, are you kidding me? I'm not 2 years old. But if you ask a cotton top tamarin monkey to do this task, uh, they cannot distinguish between these two. They are not able to do it. Uh, if I taught a class full of these things, we would be on this slide for like 2 hours. They would not be able to distinguish between the two. Um, so in other words, like with cotton top tamarin monkeys, the claim is then that because they cannot distinguish between a recursive pattern on the left, AN, BN, versus AB to the N, uh, they cannot do recursion. If they cannot recognize it, they cannot do it. So because they cannot do recursion, they cannot generate these infinitely long sentences. They cannot generate these new ideas or give more specific information when they have to. So if you do want some more information on the specific types of tasks that they did, I'll be able to post some information on that study on Canvas later. But for now, we'll just keep moving on so that way we can get through the content. Okay, so just to demonstrate this, just to really demonstrate this. And this is kind of insulting. But if we were asked to continue the pattern, CD, CCDD, what comes next after CCDD if we continue the pattern? You don't even have to do it. Let's just, I want to ask you. It's CCCDDD. Yes, thank you. Thank you for humoring me. Now, now, if I asked you to do the same thing for GH, so I'm not going to give you a pattern, just do GH. Okay, so GG, HH, good. Thank you for being the one person. You didn't have to do it, but thank you for doing it. I didn't want to insult everyone here, but you can do it. GGGHHH. Okay. Task 1 says you could do recursion. Task 2 says you can figure out the first task and you can do it again. Now, super easy. Animals, no, they cannot do it. But this is really easy. This is really easy for us. Task 1 and task 2 are actually very, very different tasks. And that might not be really obvious at first. Task 1 just says, look at this pattern and continue it. And that's a really simple task. But task 2 asks for something very different. Task 2 says, based on what you learned in the first task, so you have to remember a pattern that you learned, take something new, and then apply it. Okay, so task 2 is actually a lot more complicated than task 1, although you don't notice it because for us, it's really easy. But task 2 is significantly more complicated than task 1 because you're taking a concept you learned previously and you're applying it to something new. Okay. Does recursion have to do with the human ability of pattern recognition, like where we see faces and things that aren't, stuff like that? I don't really know if it has to do like a lot with pattern recognition. I think there's probably some aspect to it. I don't want to claim that there is a lot of overlap, but there might be some relation with it. I'm not completely sure about that though. I would not be surprised if there was development of recursion alongside pattern recognition. However, recursion is claimed to be responsible for a lot of what gives us our ability to do language. That's why I don't want to say there's a lot of overlap there, because I don't know if pattern recognition was developed alongside the same time as language was. So that's one of the long-lasting questions in language is, you know, what gave us language? Recursion is claimed to be one of those big things. So um, yeah, it's a very tough question. But yeah, animals cannot do this. That's basically the point. There's no animals that can do this. Okay, the last features. One is called tradition or cultural transmission. I like to use the word cultural transmission because it describes it quite nicely. Basically, this says that in a communication system, if they have cultural transmission, the older generation passes the language on to the younger generation. And this happens in humans. In order for a baby to acquire a language, the older generation has to give it input. They don't have to explicitly teach it. The older generation just has to speak around babies, and babies will acquire it naturally. Now, this doesn't happen in a lot of animal communication systems. It happens in some, but for instance, dogs. You take a 1-week-old puppy away from its parents and you raise it on your own, even if it doesn't get socialized with other dogs, it will still learn to bark. So it's an instinct. Um, cats as well. They'll get their full range of vocalizations. They'll still be able to communicate even if they're raised in isolation. Human babies, this will not happen. If you raise a baby in isolation without any language input, it will never acquire language fluently. We'll see a feral child in a few weeks when we talk about language acquisition, Jeannie, and we'll see what happened to her as her life went on without having any acquisition for the first 7 years of her life. Um, it does not come out nicely. Okay, three more properties left. Okay, prevarication. This property means that you can lie or you can talk nonsense. So if you have this ability, and this is intentional. So this means that you can use your speech or you can use your non-vocalization in order to mislead others or to just say whatever you want. So you don't have to speak the truth. You don't have to be reactionary. So a nice little picture of Pinocchio. Some animals have been claimed to be able to do this, and we'll see bird songs later. Uh, so usually this is for like territorial things to protect their kids or protect their territory. But we usually don't know if this is intentional or not. I mean, it might be, but it might also be just instinctual, and that is a distinction that is important to linguists, not to all linguists, but generally it's agreed upon that that's important. So usually, if it's genetically determined, if it's an instinct to the animal, then we say that's it's not intentional. But if it's not instinctual, if it's not genetically determined, then they're doing it with intent. So, if they're lying of their own free will, they have prevarication. If they're lying because it's an instinct, because it's genetics, then they don't have prevarication. Uh, learnability. Learnability is a little bit different than cultural transmission. Learnability just means that if you have different dialects or different languages, so humans, for example, German, Finnish, Polish, Russian, Chinese, all these different languages, um, you can learn someone else's dialect. So humans, even though you grow up speaking Mandarin or English or Russian, you can learn another language. That's no problem. If you're a bird, you might be able to learn some other dialect of bird song, and that's fine. If you are, I don't know, dogs don't have different dialects usually. Spiders' webs are usually pretty consistent. Yeah, but bird songs are usually a pretty good example. You can learn the call of another bird to be a mate. And the final one, reflexiveness. Reflexiveness always means to uh, discuss itself. So this is an interesting one. This basically means that using your communication system, you can discuss itself or you can discuss yourself. So the human language can be used to discuss the human language. Uh, we can use grammar to discuss grammar. We can use speech to discuss speech. Uh, no animal system can do this, as far as we know. If you ever see a group of dogs sitting outside, in your backyard around a campfire, barking at each other, discussing their own barks, that is amazing. You should probably contact someone. But until then, we don't have any evidence of any animals that discuss their own grammar or discuss their own system. That's reflexiveness. So that is it for the 12 design features of human language. There are quite a few. Most of them are pretty self-explanatory from the title of the word, at least, once you get used to what the words mean. So really maybe not self-explanatory, but if you have heard terms like reflexivity before, or tradition, or cultural transmission, or prevarication, then you might be familiar with those terms. Um, but yeah, we can put these to use now when we talk about different animals and we can discuss these. So um, I guess one thing to talk about before we move on and before I ask for any questions is that these 12 features are not necessarily the 12 features that all linguists use. Some of them have pushed these down to maybe 6 or 7. Some of them use 15 features. Some of them bundle them together. Some of them separate them out to be more specific. It really depends on who you talk to and whether they work with animals or not. Usually, linguists who work with animals for their entire lives are a lot more uh, lenient with some of the features because, of course, they're more sympathetic to animal communications and they're a little bit more open to saying they have language. They have bias, much like linguists who work specifically with human language and don't consider animals to have language are more biased towards humans. So there's a little bit of information here with an update in 2014. So not the most, so a little bit more recent, not the most recent, of course. But we will still use these 12 sort of as a historic look at what linguists have used for animal communication. So before we move on, are there any questions about these 12 features that might not have been covered? Why is reflexivity necessary if we have discreteness and duality of patterning? Aren't these necessary for reflexivity? That's a good question. So discreteness and duality of patterning allow us to say anything that we want, but that doesn't mean that everything that we say has meaning. So although so discreteness lets us have individual units of meaning, duality of patterning lets us put these units together to create new words and sentences, but that doesn't give us meaning. Um, Reflexivity is like this extra layer of meaning that says, okay, we are at this level of language where we can discuss language. So there's like this extra bit that says is reflexiveness about the consciousness. Yeah, it's a little bit more of like the fact that we can now discuss the language. We have that ability to discuss the language. It's sort of like meta language talking. It's really it's it's at the level of the mind of the animal, the mind of the human, the capacity of the human. So it is a little bit above the language compared to the other features, which makes it a little bit different than the other parts. So yeah, you did pick up on that, which is good. So like I said, when you take a look at what other linguists consider to be the design features or not, some are a little bit more, uh, you know, specific when it comes to the features, and some of them use less. So yeah, metacognition, where the brain studies the brain. Yeah. Yeah, so there are probably quite a few linguists out there that would not consider this to be an important feature, or at least a less important feature compared to other ones, like recursion or creativity or duality of patterning. Okay, so I think what we'll do is we'll take a break. for 10 minutes. I know we have something like 24 slides left, but really, we don't have to worry too much about these because the bulk of the content this week was really the first 30 slides to get the concepts out. And really, what's left this week are just examples and putting the concepts in practice with these examples. So, uh, really, what's left is connecting everything to animal species, and what you're responsible for on the assignments and the tests, of course, are applying those concepts. So the rest of the lecture today is really just examples and practicing, and the specific questions I ask throughout everything else. I don't really care too much about the specific details of everything and all the things you can look up. So if we don't get through everything, it's not a huge deal, but I'll try to cover as much ground as I can. So we'll take a 10-minute break. If you have any questions, as always, you can put them in the chat, or we can talk about them after the break over voice. So I'll see you in 10 minutes. Okay. So we'll finish this off by talking about a few examples of animals' communication systems and what they have and what they don't. There are some videos with some of these that go along. I won't watch them in lecture, but they are linked on Canvas. And they're also time-stamped in the lecture notes to watch specific examples. But we'll just talk about some of the things that they do and some specific components of them. I don't have a Stream Deck, no. I'll do it all with my mouse. Okay, so bees. Bees are one of the traditional examples for animal communication systems. Um, bees are really incredible. They have like these internal, they can track the sun with their body. So there's a specific type of bee called a foraging bee or a scout bee. They go by two different names. Um, they go out to find food. They bring a little bit of food back with them to the hive. And when they get back to the hive, they crawl onto the honeycomb and they do this little dance called a waggle dance. And what the waggle dance does is it signals to other foraging bees or scout bees where the food is. And only scout bees can perform this dance, and only scout bees can interpret this dance. And it tells them where the food is, how good the food is, and how far it is. So there's little steps to this. It's called the waggle dance because uh, they go up in a line and they do a little wiggle. So uh, how fast the wiggle is, and so like how far they go back and forth, tells us how good the food is. How long the line is tells us how far away from the hive it is. And the angle that the line is relative to the hive is the angle that the bees need to fly to get it. Now, what's incredible about this is that the angle that it is relative to the sun, but the sun moves as the bee travels. So the bee is able to remember where the sun was when it found the source, and also accounts for where the sun has moved during the time that it's traveled back to the hive when it's done the dance. So the bee can track where the sun has moved and do its angle accordingly. So as it does its little loop, it circles around back, and then it does its little waggle again, and then it goes around in another circle, and it just waggles back and forth. So then all of the other bees then know where to go to get food and bring it back to the hive. So this is how bees communicate where food is. So this is one type of animal communication system. You know what? The video is really short, so let's just watch it. It's a great video, and we can just see it. So 121. We don't need to really listen. Well, I'll share sound anyway. Sound is being shared. So very short there, but you can kind of see this in action, that little waggle that it did. So it's very short, it's very small, and it's very crowded, as you can see there. It's within a lot of the bees, but you can see that little waggle back and forth that it was doing. That's how it communicates. Are there biological differences between scout bees and other bees? Is this dance just innately known? Yeah, it's just known to scout bees. They just pick it up. This is part of their biology. Um, and no other bees know how to do this. So we could talk about each of these features just based off this small little bit of information. So you didn't get much, but we can still talk about the different features just based off what we saw, based off a little bit of wiggle dance. So interchangeability. Can bees communicate through this wiggle dance with all other bees? And the answer is no. Bees don't have interchangeability, because scout bees can only communicate with scout bees through this waggle dance. Scout bees cannot communicate with all other bees. Interchangeability says if I am a member of this species, I can communicate with any other member of the species. But with the waggle dance, this doesn't happen. Scout bees can only communicate with other scout bees. So if you're a worker bee, you can't understand this. You can't perform it. If you're the queen bee, well, you don't want to communicate or understand this. You're the queen bee. Like, what are you doing talking to scout bees? Come on, dude. Uh, arbitrariness. Well, arbitrariness. What does the waggle mean? Like, they're shaking their butts to tell you how good quality is. The line is telling you distance. The angle is telling you where it is. So, I mean, the angle isn't really arbitrary. The line telling you distance isn't really arbitrary, but the waggle telling you the quality, that's arbitrary in a sense. Why is the shaking telling you how good it is? This is kind of arbitrary. So for arbitrariness, the answer here is somewhat. No, the line for distance, this makes sense. You know, how far you move is how far it is in the real world. The angle from the sun tells you the angle it is from the hive. That makes sense. But the waggle telling you how good it is, it's kind of arbitrary here. That's why we say it's somewhat arbitrary. Productivity. If you forgot what this means, this is the same thing as creativity. So creative means if you have a new thought, you want to express something new, you can do it. Uh, creativity. Can a bee express any thought at once with the waggle dance? Yeah, no, it can't. No. If it wants to talk about a different type of food it found, it can't do that. It just can only say, I found a food source over there and it's this good. It can't tell you what the food source is. Is there like a scale with line length and physical distance? Yeah, probably. Within the hive, within the worker bees, or sorry, within the foraging bees and scout bees, there's probably some system or some scale that they understand. So if it's so far, they know a general distance of how far that is. I don't know if it's been measured exactly and if it's the same between every single hive, but they know roughly how far it is. Displacement. Can they talk about things that are far in distance or far in time? Well, the answer to this one is somewhat. And distance. So they can talk about where something is far away from them. That's what they communicate. And they can talk about something that they found maybe an hour ago, but they can't talk about the future. They can't talk about things they found a week or two ago. They can't talk about things that they found like several kilometers or away. It's got to be, within a general vicinity. So we can't say yes, they don't have free range. Um, but they can talk about close food sources, things close in time and close in space. They don't have the same range that humans have. Recursion. Recursion. Can they take a waggle dance and put a waggle dance inside a waggle dance to communicate a more specific waggle dance? Uh, we have no evidence of that. In fact, recursion is always an easy one because no animals have ever demonstrated recursion ever. Tradition. Tradition is cultural transmission. So does a daddy scout bee teach its kids how to do the waggle dance? Well, for this one, I have no evidence, always meaning no. So if you're ever unsure because there's not enough information, no and no evidence will always be similar. So in this case, there's really no evidence. We didn't see from the video or from the slides whether or not it's biologically innate or whether it's taught. In this case, it's innate, it's not taught. So we can say no or no evidence. Um, they mean the same thing for us in this case. So no, no evidence. We don't see that. Can the bees lie? Can the bees lie about where the food is or how far away it is? Same thing in this case. There's no evidence of it. And in reality, no, the bees cannot lie about where the food is. Learnability. Can a scout bee learn the waggle dance of another hive scout bee? In this case, no, there's not really different dialects. And we wouldn't see this from the video. This wasn't mentioned. So again, we would say there's no evidence of this. Not enough information given. But in reality, again, this is no. This doesn't happen in real life bees. They don't have different dialects, but there's no evidence. So this is what we would say for bees. Uh, they show arbitrariness somewhat, they show displacement somewhat, but for the other design features of human language, they don't really have any evidence of them. So yeah, it's an animal communication system, but it still shows, some of the human properties, just not a lot of them. And that's what we'll find with a lot of the different animal communication systems. There's some hints of them, but not much. And the closer we get to monkeys, the more features we're going to see because monkeys are a lot closer to humans in the evolutionary chain than bees. So there's really no coincidence there. There's really no surprises there. Is this the type of question we can expect on our test? Yes, this is the type of question. And usually what I'll do is I'll give you an animal and I'll give you a nice detailed description of what the animal can do. And then I'll ask a specific question about the property. And then you say yes, somewhat, no evidence, and a brief little description if it's short answer, just, multiple choice if it's not. So it's really, understanding the concepts and then applying the concepts. That's sort of the goal. So this is what I'm running through here. Running through with you here is talking about the feature and then saying yes, somewhat no, and then explaining why. So are there any questions about these before I move on? Okay, if you're typing, I will get to you when you finish typing. Um, one more thing about bees. So the waggle dance isn't actually the only thing they do to make sure that their communication is successful. Um, there may be problems with their dance. They may get the angle slightly wrong. They may get the distance slightly wrong. They may get the quality wrong. So they use redundancy. They do some extra things to make sure that they will get the food. So the waggle dance is good. You can call it the bee dance too. Um, but they do two more things. One thing that they do is they carry a little bit of food back to the hive with them. So that way they can get some odor. So that way the other scout bees can recognize what the food smells like. So that way when they fly out, they can recognize the scent and they can hone in on the food. Um, but they also leave their own pheromones on the site itself. So that way, when they fly close, they can also pick up on the pheromones of that scout bee and they can hone in on the site. So that way, the waggle dance just has to be generally accurate. And then when the bees get close, they can find the specific food source. So that way, if there's any failure in the dance, the bees can still find the food. So This is called redundancy. And this makes sure that communication is successful even if there are problems. And human language has this too. So there's redundancy in every language on Earth. So we have this in spelling too. So here's just a fun example. We don't need to see all of a word in order to recognize it. So for example, in English, I mean, there's only so many words in English that start with RECO and then with ZE. So you don't need to see those middle letters because, there's only going to be one word that has those, at least with that length too. So those middle letters are really redundant. But in regular language too, we have redundancy. So those is plural. So when we hear those and we get a word like cat, we don't really need this S to understand it. Those cats, because the S is also plural. We could say those cat and we could understand it. It just doesn't sound right. It's redundant. It's grammatical to say those cats. We need it to sound, or we need the S, those cats, for it to be grammatical, but we don't really need it to understand what's being said. So it's redundancy. It's grammatical redundancy. It's necessary redundancy, but it's in the language. That's why if we hear second language speakers of English and they make those mistakes, it's not a big deal for comprehension. We still understand it. But we have redundancy, and it's not just plurality. Um, English has word order and case for some reason. I shouldn't say for some reason. Most languages have these things too. But if we have a sentence like "She loves him," there's some redundancy here with pronouns. So she loves him. A word like him or a word like she, these are pronouns. And pronouns have different forms depending on where in the sentence they are. So him and he are two different forms, and she and her are two different forms. So him is used in what's called the object position, and he is used in the subject position. Subjects appear at the beginning, objects appear at the end. She is used in a subject position, and her is used in an object position. Again, subject at the beginning, object at the end. So a sentence like she loves him has redundancy in it because if we see the sentence she loves him, the word order already tells us what the subject and what the object is. But the pronouns also have a form too that tell us what the subject and what the object is because it's she, so we know she is the subject, it's him, so we know him is the object. So we have redundancy here because, you know, she is the subject and it's in the subject form. It's the first word in the sentence, so we know it's the subject. If we said her loves him, well, we still know her as the subject because her is the first word in the sentence. Oh, we said her loves he. Oh, we'd still understand that he is the object because he is the last word in the sentence. So we have some redundancy here. And that's fine. It's just make sure that our communication is successful. So that's just an example of redundancy in human language. And this will happen in many different animal systems as well. So there's some more technical terms on the slide here if you're interested, but we'll cover the important stuff next week when we talk about theoretical language. Okay, a little bit about birds. We won't spend too much time on birds. You might not know this, but there's a difference between bird calls and bird songs. So bird calls are very short. Usually when I think of a bird call, I think about a crow, like the caw of a crow. They're very short. Usually these are like warnings of predators or just like we need to fly, like get out or go up. Um, and these happen all the time. Songs, however, are much more elaborate. They usually have some sort of bigger purpose, like they're trying to attract another bird for mating, they're territorial, and these are usually unique to species or even from bird to bird. So when a male tries to attract a female, it might try to match the same pattern as a female bird. And so bird songs are a lot more elaborate. So we can listen to a bird song. I'll just play this in the background. We don't actually need to play the video. But you can hear this bird song is definitely more elaborate than just a call. It's a lot longer. So bird songs are definitely more elaborate than bird calls. And again, what's interesting, uh, a few things which are important for our design features is that bird songs are generally only produced by males. So most females cannot produce these. They can understand them, but they cannot produce them. And there are different dialects among bird species. So this opens up learnability because birds can learn other dialects of birds. And yes, exactly what was brought up in chat. There can be an issue with interchangeability as well because the female birds cannot produce them. So they cannot talk back to the male birds. So yeah, you're thinking about the design features right now. Um, so another thing with calling versus songs is that yeah, calling can be done by any bird, and a lot of that is innate. So they're born with that. So even if they're raised in isolation, they can still call. But songs have to be learned. Um, so you learn the songs from other birds in your nest when you're a male, and if you don't grow up with other birds, you may not learn a song. And you can imagine that can cause issues with mating or territories as you grow older and you try to fly out and become independent as a bird. What's really interesting in terms of like brain lateralization and actually linguistic ability is that bird songs is in the same side of the brain as linguistic ability in humans. So there is some tie-in with language in the brain. It's a very loose tie-in, but the same lateralization meaning that the brain is split into two hemispheres, the left side and the right side. So bird singing abilities, sorry, this is mirrored on my screen. So the bird singing abilities is on the same side as language in humans. So what I mentioned before when I said that, birds have to acquire it their song at a certain time. This is called a critical period. And this is the same thing with humans when I said that when you have a baby who grows up, they need to acquire language within a certain age, otherwise, they don't acquire it. This is a critical period in human language as well. So there's a certain age, usually in humans, it's between 0 and 5 years old, where you have to get language input. And if you don't get language input during that time, you can really struggle to pick up language and you may never acquire it. It's the same thing with bird songs. If they don't get it during a certain period, I'm not quite sure what the age is for birds, but if they don't acquire it during that period, they may never acquire it ever, and that can cause serious problems for them when they're older. So I don't have a practice with this one, but when we think about the design features here with birds, they're not going to have learnability. Or sorry. They are going to have learnability because they have different dialects. So, learnability is good because a male bird can learn the dialects of other birds. This is different from bees because birds have different dialects. Interchangeability is a problem because female birds cannot sing back to male birds. Uh, I'm trying to think of, are there any other like unique design features that stand out compared to what we talked about before? Um, uh, I guess for this one, tradition. Tradition is another big one. Tradition here, the fact that the song has to be taught from an older generation to a newer generation. This is something that is present with these birds because they have to be taught from older birds to a younger bird within that critical period. So that's something that birds have that, say, the bees didn't. So these three design features are maybe, well, learnability and tradition specifically are two unique design features that are different from what birds have. So these would be very clear yeses that the bees did not have. So are there any questions about birds? Why are some birds able to imitate human speech? Oh, like parrots. Yeah, that's an interesting question. Well, it's interesting, right? Because they don't have the same vocal tracts as humans. There's a parrot, Alex, that is talked about quite a bit. I'll see if I can get some information on Alex for you. I don't know the exact answer to that question for why they can imitate it, but I do want to emphasize it is imitation. It is definitely not actual human speech. They just imitate the sounds. So I'll see if I can find something on the actual vocal components of a bird for you. But yeah, I don't have an actual specific answer for that at this point in time. Okay. So I want to briefly talk about monkeys. I have quite a few monkeys here in the slides. We won't cover all of them, but you can look through them. There's one question in the practice exercise about the monkeys, though. I'll figure out how to deal with that in a second. So just generally with non-human primates, here's a little chart about our ancestors. So non-human primates, you can just think of these as everything except for us as humans. And typically, every non-human primate can do a few things. They can mark and announce their territory. They can talk about, dangers. They can maintain relationships with others, and they can socialize. So, very basic things that we can do as well. And these are impressive things. So, maintaining contact with a mate and other members of a species and socializing, like we should not think of these as like unimpressive features. These are quite impressive. The fact that primates could use tools too is impressive. Um, so you can always refer back to these to see how far away they are. So we start with vervet monkeys. These are um, distantly related, and then as we go further, they get more and more related to us. So vervet monkeys, what's really special about them is that they have different calls depending on the type of predator that is attacking them. So there are air predators, there are ground predators, like very close to the ground, and there are land predators. So, like snakes being very close to the ground and slower, leopards being faster, ground predators, things that can try to climb trees but fail, and then eagles being air predators. And they have calls for each one. Um, Now, what's special about these is that they're not instinctual. The monkeys actually think about these calls before they make them. So, unlike a lot of other animals who have calls for predators, these are just like bodily responses. Vervets actually think about them. So, they assess the situation and they call them out. So, they're not symptomatic like other species. And that's what makes these a little bit more interesting because they think about the language that they use. So, that's really what's special about the vervet monkey. Um, They have this arbitrariness feature to them that, um, like every monkey has arbitrariness, which is, sort of the special idea here. But vervet monkeys were really one of the original um, monkeys that were studied. They're one of the older monkeys that were distantly related and very promising. So, although they're very distantly related, very promising for studies for language. They're very close to us. So if there's any animal that should have language, it should be some sort of non-human primate. So even though they're distantly related, as we get closer, like chimpanzees and orangutans, we should see something that's a little bit more promising. So looking at vervet monkeys, Uh, it's already a pretty good sign. Chimpanzees are closer related, 34 distinct calls from these guys. And this is where we started our studies to teach them human language. And human language studies on chimps did not go well. In the 1930s and 1950s, they started and they found out very quickly that chimps cannot produce human sounds. And now this is obvious to us, but back then in the 30s and 50s, this was not. Two monkeys, Gua and Vicky, they tried to teach them human sounds. What happened in the 30s was that Gua and a baby were raised together. The baby started making monkey sounds, so they terminated that. And in the 50s, Vicky was not producing human sounds, so they terminated that study. They kept the monkeys alive, don't worry. But it turns out monkeys have a different vocal tract than humans, so they can't produce the same sounds. Who would have thought? Basically, if we take a look here at this part, this is called the epiglottis and the velum. In monkeys, these can close together, they can touch. In humans, they're quite far apart. Also, some areas of the palate and the tongue cannot interact compared to humans, so we just have very different vocal tracts. So if we want to do studies with chimps, we have to do something different. We have to use sign language or symbols or something. So American Sign Language has been used a lot with monkey studies, and one of the first chimp studies was with Washu. So they started with sign language, and Washu learned about 85 words. And Washu first started with two-word combinations, so like hug and hurry, or water and bird. So at first, this was quite great. Hug, hurry, water, bird. Wise monkey. Yeah, great. Um, Arbitrary signs. So he picked up arbitrariness. That's great. But the problem with this monkey was that even though he produced things like hug and hurry, they weren't sure that this meant hurry and hug me, or that water and bird meant a water bird. So the fact that he produced A and B didn't necessarily mean that he meant A plus B as a combo. And what I mean here, it's like if you took the word black, so uh, if you took black and board, this doesn't necessarily mean that you would get a word like blackboard. So, sort of like this comparison. So, you couldn't really claim with this monkey that he understood what the pair of words meant. It just meant that he was doing individual signs together. So, he did learn 85 words, but he didn't have this understanding of like compound words or phrases. So, a successful study. Yeah, like humans saying phrases from other languages. Yeah, they just put two words together, but they don't understand the nuances or what it means when two words are put together. So, this wasn't a failure of a study. The monkey learned 100 words. Quite good. That was one of the first studies. The monkey picked up arbitrariness. That's fantastic. And there's an article here that you can read if you're interested. The next one, Nim Chimpsky, a play on the name of Noam Chomsky. This monkey learned 130 signs, so a little bit more, but sort of the same issue. And this monkey, uh, yeah, same issue as the previous monkey. But this monkey produced longer signs, but there was no structure to them, and there was a lot of repetition. So he'd say things like "nim," "me," "you," "eat," "drink," "more," "give," and like, what does this mean? And he made a really long sentence, so I wrote that there. Give orange, me give, eat orange, me eat orange, give me eat orange, give me you. Like, sure, he produced a long sentence, but what does it mean? Is this impressive? Yes or no? Is this productive? Not really. So this was the second experiment with chimps, and it was about as successful as the first. Sure, it showed some arbitrariness. It showed the ability that monkeys can learn sign language, but again, there's no syntactic structure here. There's no understanding of combinations of words. Sarah was the third monkey here, and This was the first monkey to not use sign language. Instead, Sarah used symbols, just arbitrary symbols. Uh, there was nothing representing the actual thing. So, like this square, for instance, you might not be able to see this text, but that square meant banana. And to communicate, she would put the symbols together in a string to make a sentence. So she put them up in a line and she'd communicate. So in order to get a reward, she'd put the symbols in a row and that would be a sentence and she'd get a reward if she did it right. So she'd say things like, Mary give banana Sarah, or Sarah insert banana pale apple dish. So again, more arbitrariness demonstrated here with symbols instead of sign language. That seems pretty promising. However, even though there's some impressive things like if then being taught, uh, did Sarah really learn language or was she just conditioned? Did she just figure out a puzzle? Was she like a rat in a cage who learned that when the rat presses the button, it gets food? Did the monkey just learn that when these symbols were in an order, she got a prize, she got a reward? That's sort of what was happening here. That's what it was believed, that Sarah didn't learn sentence structure. She just learned something that was like a puzzle. She learned patterns. She didn't learn language. So Sarah learned arbitrariness, but we don't think she learned syntactic structure. So all the monkeys so far, you know, they've learned some arbitrariness skills, but they still haven't shown sentence structure, which is what we need. That's really what we're looking for. We need some structure. Okay, here is our baby Coco. Um, this was the king or the queen of our monkeys. Coco was very famous. You can find many articles on Coco. Coco was huge in the media. Coco knew about 2,000 words. Coco took an IQ test that was aimed for kids between 5 to 6, and she scored between 70 to 90 IQ. She was equivalent to a 5-year-old kid. Um, there was a few documentaries in the past 4 years that have been put on Coco that are quite interesting. Um, so yeah, Coco knew a couple thousand signs, and she has been shown to make a lot of spontaneous combinations like soft, good, cat, cat. You can see a lot of different combinations here. So instead of for rich tapioca pudding, she would make signs like milk candy, or for pick face instead of tweezers. Now, in the media, of course, they want to claim that yes, she knew language, and her caretakers, of course, want to claim that she learned language. Uh, the reality, though, is that we don't have evidence that she actually knew sentence structure, that she knew the difference between things like adjectives and nouns in the same way that humans do. And we're also not sure that she really did spontaneously sign things, that people didn't give her unintentional cues when she was being successful. It's quite often the case that researchers who are close with the animals that they raise give unintentional cues, like good signs when their animals do things good that are new, and they're not even aware of it because they're so close. But um, we'll talk about it in just a minute. There's a horse that amazed the world. So unfortunately, this is the most impressive monkey to have ever produced sign language ever. But um, still not enough evidence to say that yes, this monkey has learned language. Still very impressive, but there's still a good chance that um, this monkey was just given some false cues from the researcher that said, yes, what you produced is good, when in reality, is sort of coincidental. How can we be sure of this nature? Like, at what point can we claim that a monkey or another animal actually understands language? Well, uh, through rigorous experimentation with double-blind tests and with the researchers and the experimenters, being away from the monkey. Um, it really it really depends. I mean, it depends on the linguists who are testing. Um, the people who would say that Coco speaks language are the animal researchers, right? The people who would say that the animal that Coco doesn't speak language are the linguists who study theoretical language and the ones who are more skeptical. Um, that's usually how it is in nature. So that's just how the critics are. I mean, there's probably ERP studies too that can be done, brain studies, but again, you have to know the monkey names. So what if they use the same thing to test for AI? I mean, yeah, there's a lot of concerns with this, right? So we'll skip the design features, but I want to talk about this clever Hans horse, and that'll be sort of the end where we stop, because this will demonstrate the problem with Coco and usually the problem with animals in general. So clever Hans was a horse. It was a magical horse who could answer any mathematics problem in the world. You could ask it any question, and it would do this for crowds. It would travel around the United States and answer any question. It got so smart that it could answer any question about anything. What it would do is you would ask it a question about science, and it would tap its foot for letters. So one tap would be A, two taps would be B. And in front of a crowd, even without its owner there, it could tap the answer to any question you would ask it, and it would get it right. And scientists were even amazed because they thought for sure that it was the owner who was feeding the horse answers somehow. But when the owner was out of the room, the horse was still getting the questions right. And this was way back in the 40s. So there was no fancy machinery or trickery going on. So how could a horse get science questions right when the owner was away? Well, the horse was really good at picking up cues from humans because when the horse was close to getting an answer right, the audience would tense up. And as soon as the horse would get to the right letter, the right tap of the foot for the number for a math question or the letter for, um, a science question or something, the audience would let out a sigh of relief. They would let the tension out, and the horse would know at that point to stop tapping. So the horse was trained when to stop tapping, and because of that, it could answer any question in the world as long as the audience knew the answer to the question. So the horse could appear very, very smart just by some simple training from picking up cues from the audience. So this is called the clever Hans effect. So it appears to understand language and it appears to speak language and it appears to be brilliant, but really all it's doing is picking up on physical cues. So animals are cued by trainers to give the desired responses. And this is also called dressage. Usually dressage is in the case of horses now. So uh, there's just dressage competitions. So the animals react to gestures and facial expressions. Um, and many times the researchers and experimenters and the trainers are not aware of this. They don't realize they're doing this. So in the case of Coco and other chimps and other animal studies, the owners don't know that they're doing this. They genuinely believe that their animals are doing this on their own, but they don't realize that the animals that they're raising have picked up on cues, subtle cues that their owners are giving off of. So this is where, uh, animals like Coco and the controversy about Coco, this is where it comes up. And this is why Patterson, who lived with Coco for so many years and raised her, are still very defendant about this. I mean, because even on camera, when you look at video evidence, it's still very hard to pick up because these are very subtle cues that they make. But this is the argument, is that this is just another clever Hans effect, but the owner's not aware of this. But isn't all language taught from cues? Like the baby video at the beginning of class, whenever they did something correct, the adults would coo and say, "Good job." How can that be something that disproves understanding? We'll talk about this a bit in first language acquisition, but actually, in terms of language acquisition, rewarding a child and disciplining a child for saying good or bad things isn't actually a big contribution to language acquisition. Um, Rewarding and uh, punishment isn't really that big. It's just about input. It's just about talking back. Usually, when you correct a child, they don't actually correct themselves after they say that. They just keep repeating what they've already said. It's just really about input. So, um, yeah, I don't know if the horse actually would have learned from the fact that the audience was impressed with it getting it right. It's more just so about the attention. I guess maybe at the beginning when it's rewarded, when it first learns the trick, maybe. But I think after a certain amount of time, it would have just got used to it. I'm not quite sure. But human babies and human language is quite different from operant conditioning. Yeah, human language isn't quite as simple as just regular conditioning. If it was, feral children would be able to pick up language a little bit later in life. Is it because we mature brain-wise? Well, mature brain-wise, you definitely lose your critical period, and you're not able to pick up language as easily. We will talk a little bit more about first language acquisition, though, a little bit later, and how we pick it up, whether it's nature or nurture, and things like that. Um, so the last thing before we stop, I'll just talk about two things, and the conclusions I'll leave you with those slides because they pretty much just summarize what I've talked about in lecture. So usually with animal language observations, like there's three big problems. One is the clever Hans effect, where the trainers are giving these cues, but two other things. One is that we want to assume that animals are showing good signs before they actually show good signs. So, if Washu is saying water bird, we just want to make that assumption immediately that, wow, he's got that compound down, when really he might not. So we want to make that assumption quick because we're excited. And that's what happens early in studies. So we need to be skeptical about that. Uh, and the third thing, and this was a problem with early studies, which wasn't mentioned before, but if Washu earlier says what that when he was given any noun, like he questioned what that was, the answer was considered correct because he questioned an object. So the researchers assumed that Washu understood that it was an object and questioned what the object was. But that's not the best thing to do, right? Because did he really understand that it was an object, or is he just saying, oh, I can just sign what that if I'm not sure, or I can just sign what that whenever? Is that really an accurate observation? Should it have been someone else writing down the observations and recording whether or not it was successful? Um, and that's really sort of the solution to things. When we do animal studies, we should have other researchers involved. We should do these double blind tests, as they're called, where one researcher shows the chimp an object or, uh, does work with the chimp. A second researcher is recording the signing. They don't see researcher one. They don't see what researcher one is showing the chimp. So they have no idea what researcher one is doing. They're just looking at what the researchers, or they're just looking at what the chimp is signing. And then there's a third researcher that's just looking at the recording of what the chimp is doing, and they're just writing things down and interpreting it. So that way, there's no bias. They don't know what happened with researcher one. They don't know what the inputs were. They're just looking at the outputs and they're just recording the outputs. And then they can finally take a look at the end and say, okay, this is how successful it was. These are the final results. And then they can analyze the data and say, oh, look, actually, this monkey only had a 20% success rate instead of, oh, hey, this monkey had a 90% success rate or whatever. Okay, so that was a whirlwind tour of all the different animals, but this is what the main animals have been in animal research in the past 30, 40, 50 years. Not much animal research is done anymore with language. This was sort of a relic of the past. A little bit is done nowadays, but not as often as before. That's really not the focus of what linguistics is at the moment, but we may see it come back in the future. Who knows? There's a little bit more on these slides about animal research and conclusions. If you're interested in that, they kind of cover what we talked about before. Um, Basically, there are still some linguists out there who believe that animals have language, and there's a lot of linguists who believe that they don't. It depends how close they are to animals, and it depends on what their view of language is. But yeah, that was it for animal communication. If there's any questions about that, I can stick around after lecture for you to ask questions. Assignment one is now released. There's a little 10-minute video on the front page that goes over it, but you can always just look at the assignment one sheet on Canvas as well. All the information's there. The video is just there for me to go over it as well over voice in case there's some extra information you might need. But yeah, that's it for today. I'll see you all next week. And if you have any questions, you can post them on Canvas, you can email me, or you can go on the Discord because I'm there now. So yeah, that's it. Have a good week. See you all next Wednesday.
I was wondering if I could stay maybe after. I had a quick question, not quite this class related.
Okay, yeah, that's no problem.